Hey everyone, welcome back to the Naked Without Shame podcast. This is Megan here. Today, Morgan and I are going to be talking about the notions of suspicion in the heart as well as fear and how those things impact our ability to love well and to see reality as love. Stay tuned.
Open your cards, open up your heart to Christ. Do not be afraid.
As always, Morgan and I want to invite you to consider joining our patronage community based on John Paul II's book called The Jeweler Shop. There's different levels that you can give to just support our podcast. We'd be delighted if you considered providing a financial donation so that we can continue doing what we do, talking together so that you can listen to our thoughts on theology of the body. To do that, you can go to nakedwithoutshameshow.com. And also, if you are interested in just getting more plugged into the Awaken community, you can join the Awaken app. The app has lots of cool features like having access to each show that the Awaken Catholic ministry produces, and then also just different ways to reach out to community. There's prayers, there's lots of cool features. So go ahead and check that out by going to theawakenapp.io. Okay, hey Morgan.
Hello.
Okay, are you ready to talk about suspicion?
I am.
Yes, this is something we all know way too well. Most of us.
Yes.
I'm sure there are some people walking around that just feel perfectly, I don't know, at peace, not skeptical.
Life.
Right. Yeah.
That would be great.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
That would be really great. And it could, could be a good existence. But for most of us, let's just talk about this reality of the notion of suspicion in light of the theology of the body and just historical man in the here and now, the human experience that can, just help us illuminate more about what we experience and how to redeem it. So I guess the idea of suspicion was something I wanted to talk about once again, because of like the universality of this tendency that we have to walk around and be kind of like fearful or suspicious that something bad might happen, or, in the realm of human relationships, like somebody's going to hurt me. And even if we have arrived at a place in our lives that our relationships are really solid, very intact, and very healing, there's probably still things operating within us from our past that can kind of come up that can cause these moments of like fear and suspicion in relationships. So
I think of this kind of modern psychological phrase, catastrophizing. Have you ever heard that?
Oh, yeah.
Like people tend to catastrophize. Like you constantly think that like basically everything's going to lead to a catastrophe. Like the worst possible thing will happen. And how it's this kind of, it goes along, I think, oftentimes with like anxiety, people who suffer from anxiety of some sort or depression, like there's just this, like you assume the worst.
You assume the worst.
So that's kind of what we're trying to talk about. Maybe if that's more familiar to you, this idea of catastrophizing. If you do that, people that do that, we want to kind of understand, why do we do that? And how can we overcome that? And not constantly be catastrophizing, like thinking everything's just bad all the time.
Right. Well, I think the reason why, very simply, as to why we do catastrophize or act out of suspicion is because it's a consequence of original sin. It's a consequence of the fact that, like, we don't live in a perfect world. Bad things do happen, right? And so our body kind of learns that, in order to survive or in order to live well, I need to remember what is threatening to me.
Yeah, right? I need to be kind of constantly on edge.
Yeah.
Ready for the worst. Like,
Yes.
Yeah, it is
Ready?
it's a memory that we hold in our bodies. I think oftentimes, like when we have bad experiences, I mean, we all have bad experiences, but some people, worse than others, or some people carry that experience differently than others, and it's not kind of processed or healed adequately. And so then it becomes this kind of like disposition that's very ingrained in the person of like, you're kind of almost in like a fight or flight constantly. Like, I need to be ready for like an attack.
Right. Yes.
Figuratively, but like,
yes.
Even like thinking of like the sort of like the animal roots of our brains, right? Like in our brains, like we literally, the caveman roots or whatever they say. Like,
yeah, like the old brain.
It's kind of the same thing of like, we think we're going to be attacked by like a wolf or something, or like a predator. And so,
yes,
it's kind of the same thing is happening today in our modern society. And we're like we're constantly poised or posed for this like fight or flight kind of thing. And so, yeah.
And in particular in relationships, I think that's maybe what I want to hone in on, right? This idea that like relationships can be a place of suspicion, right? Precisely because of concupiscence, because of, the difficulty in our culture to know love and to love well, right? So I think, John Paul II does mention this, like when he talks about historical man, like after the fall. And I think because like sin exists in the world, because there can be something to be suspicious of, like people's freedom, right? The fact that people have freedom can choose to love or to harm us. And so we're always like wrestling with that tension, right? Of the human freedom of someone else.
Yeah.
And so when you know this, that can create this sense of like, oh my gosh, like, am I going to be safe? And especially like, am I going to be safe in a relationship?
Yes.
And I think what's really important though with the theology of the body is that as John Paul II talks about the reality of concupiscence, the reality of sin, and the ability for people to hurt us, right? It's that this is not actually fundamental though to the anthropology of the person.
Yes.
Right? So when you are, kind of walking around in life, you're interacting with people, I think the point is like the vision of the human person in front of you is not like based on this ability to like hurt you and then therefore you should be suspicious. Like I think John Paul II is trying to call us to like something greater in so far as like human love can be redeemed, right? And Christ ultimately tells us that, right? That we can live in relationship in a peaceful, loving, fruitful way and to be secure in that, right? We can relearn if we've been hurt before, like we can relearn those things. I think this vision of suspicion or anxiety or catastrophizing, right, in relationships is prevalent. I think everybody can relate to this because nobody loves perfectly. I think also the point about this vision, right, of the world around you or the people around you in this suspicious way is also not like coherent with the paradigm of love, with the paradigm that I can see the world once again as gift, as we always say. I can see the world as safe. I can see the world as like good for me and that God is taking care of me. Right? So I just want to like really get into that difference, right? The vision or the worldview of suspicion because of sin and the worldview of security, peace, love, that vision. I want to kind of like compare and contrast and kind of get at the heart of that.
And how do we get back to this, lack of suspicion that you're saying, this like understanding of the world as a gift. because you were saying before, like in John Paul II says in Theology of the Body, like this suspicion, this concupiscence, right, that leads to suspicion, this tendency to sin that leads to suspicion, is not inherent to my humanity or to the humanity of others. It's an indication that there's something wrong that needs to be healed. And how does that healing happen? I think that's like everyone's really concrete question about this. Like, okay, I know that like maybe I shouldn't catastrophize, and that it's not maybe not even reasonable to catastrophize. Like most of the time, like bad things don't happen, hopefully. Like, you know, but how do I like stop bracing myself for something bad to happen all the time? Especially like you're saying in relationships where like these wounds are so detrimental to my humanity, right? So like if a wound of love particularly, I think is so hard to kind of, heal from, and then not, you don't brace yourself in all your relationships, like I was saying, and like anticipate the worst. So
exactly.
Yeah. How do you heal? I guess maybe.
Yeah. How do you redeem it? How do you get out of that state? Well, it can be really difficult because of, you know, like the response of the body, right? We're not just a memory or like the fear that we think of, right? It's like we're also connected to a body. We are a body. And so that like plays out, right, physiologically. And so, you know, that's one other thing to like think about. It's like the body is even responding. So it's not unable to be overcome, but it's just, it's like in us very deeply. I guess what helps me to begin to like live in a place of seeing people like as love and gift and not through the eyes of suspicion is to start thinking about like how Christ would ultimately kind of handle concupiscence. Like, how did he handle concupiscence? you know, like how did he handle like when, you know, Peter betrayed him or Judas, right? Like how would he have like recognized the concupiscence and not, Morgan, where'd you go?
Sorry.
It's okay.
Technical difficulty.
Yeah.
I'm back.
Okay, great. Like how would Christ have handled that reality while remaining open, I guess, and remaining positive with the vision of love of another and the goodness of another person?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. What comes to mind is that like Christ uniquely, because he's God, is able to, like you're saying, maintain this perfect openness and recognize that I may be wounded, and to allow himself to be wounded. Right. I mean, that's the kind of the whole point of his life, is to sort of like be open to a world that in some ways is against him and will ultimately crucify him. Right. And like to love that world in spite of that. I mean, that, you know, to us, we're not God, right? That sounds impossible. Like, how could we possibly participate in that kind of openness, that lack of suspicion, right? That Christ had, and like be willing to like allow ourselves to be hurt even. How could, I guess like, how could Christ do that? Okay, one answer, because he's God. Yeah. But I think, you know, unpacking more what that means, like he has this perfect relationship to the Father, right? That's the nature of Christ's identity, is to be totally related to the Father, to be totally from the Father. And that creates this perfect security, this perfect sense of like being loved and being safe in that love, that then allows for complete openness. Right. Right. So I think that some, you know, a clue to the answer must be, how do we kind of retrieve this sense of perfect safety, we'll say, or like perfect being loved, a perfect state of being loved, perfectly being loved. Yeah. How do we How do we get back
Sure.
to that?
Sure. I definitely think that is a clue, and that's a piece of it. Like when you see that God is taking care of you, like all around you, that can definitely help, right? It can totally help. I do think though that like the specific events of concupiscence or that have made us suspicious are like what in a way like need to be healed and like addressed. And whether that's like with God, like entering back into those with God, right? Or maybe it's simply like, you know, as you were saying, like Christ's ability to suffer, like that was kind of why he came. He was open to what we were going to do. He loved so much that he was open to what we would do in crucifying him. So there must be like, I don't know, I feel like this is kind of a psychological talk, but yeah, I mean, it relates. TOB and psychology go definitely together. But there seems to me to need to be an acceptance either way, right? Because we can't stop like concupiscence or people potentially hurting us. We can't stop that, right? We can be aware of it. But so insofar as like we can't control the outcome, yes, we can avoid it.
You know, we can try to not put ourselves in situations that like will be
harmful to us,
or it will be harmful to us. Exactly. But like you're saying, that's not always in our control.
It's not always in our control.
The other person has freedom.
Right. Just like Christ allowed the freedom of his crucifiers to go through with that, to crucify him, right?
Yes.
So even Christ like can't control human freedom, like in a way, like he created it. God created us, but yeah, this idea is like hard to grapple with. But I think what I want to say is that in order to heal suspicion, there has to be an acceptance of like the possibility of continued hurt, potential hurt, right? Even though like it's really hard and there's triggers that we have, like things can remind us of bad experiences, but do you see what I mean? There has to be like an openness that Christ had to like, I accept that like to love someone means to extend myself. And if I am rejected or if I am hurt, like I can accept that. And as you said, because I'm secure, like I find a security in God.
Yeah, I think that one thing that comes to mind is Christ's suffering was very real. We have to, say that Christ's suffering was very real. Yeah. It was very human, It wasn't just like a show. It was a reality. He really did suffer. But his suffering was different than ours in the sense, this is me kind of going off the cuff. I don't know if this is right, but I'm willing to say like his suffering was different in the sense that it didn't ever go to the level of his identity. It didn't threaten his identity. And that's how our suffering is different. I mean, especially when we talked in our last episode about these wounds of origin, like these really serious wounds that kind of like shake the foundation of our humanity. So like with oftentimes like in our childhood where their parents in like just those early formative years, like how those kind of wounds in a certain sense, like why they're so difficult to overcome and heal from, and why they tend to, more than any other, kind of wound, create this, what you're saying, what we're talking about, this disposition of suspicion and like this like constant like bracing myself for something bad to happen. I think that wounds of origin have a particular way of creating that mentality in us. And why they do that, I think, is because they threaten our identity.
That's a good point.
Like, they threaten, again, like we tried to unpack last time, like they threaten our sense of who we are as humans and the fact that we're most basically loved. We're created from love and we are loved. If that identity, the fundamental identity is threatened somehow, which so often, unfortunately, it is for, I would probably say most of us in some way, that's what needs to be healed. That wound to our identity. Because like I'm saying, like the reason why Christ could allowed suffering, like he was able to suffer, was able to withstand suffering, is because that basic core of who he is and his relationship to the Father was never threatened, whereas ours is because of sin, right?
Yes,
And
that's
that
a good distinction.
manifests itself concretely through these wounds that we experience in life. And like when we're hurt, it's not like, it's the difference between like, okay, someone hurts me and it's painful, but like at the same time, I'm still able to like know, okay, fundamentally, this is who I am. I'm loved. I'm good. There's nothing wrong with me. The fact that I'm hurt doesn't mean that there's something wrong with me. It doesn't mean that I'm bad. It doesn't threaten this like basic sense of who I am as good and as loved, right? There's a very huge difference between that kind of suffering, which is I think a little more analogous to how Christ suffered, and how we oftentimes suffer in our lives, where it's like someone does something bad to me and I internalize that and think that means that there's something fundamentally wrong with me. Actually, I'm not lovable. I'm not loved. I'm bad. Right? That kind of suffering, actually, we can't withstand, in the sense that it needs to be healed in order for us to have a healthy relationship with ourselves and with God and with others. You see what I'm saying?
I do. So it goes deep. Like there's
it goes
certain,
so deep.
right?
Yes.
So unlike Christ, who had like perfect union with the Father, his identity wasn't threatened when people sinned around him. Right. He wasn't suspicious.
And people inflicted suffering on him.
Right.
Exactly.
He wasn't suspicious. He was able to accept the human freedom and whatever came from that. Right. Whereas like we, in our, like the consequences of concupiscence, the consequences is not only suspicion, but it's like this tie to, once again, like an obscuring of who am I? Am I loved? If you've treated me poorly, like maybe that means I'm bad.
Yeah.
You know.
So my fundamental identity is somehow in question.
Yes. Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that kind of suffering is never like fruitful or good, you know, whereas Christ's suffering was incredibly fruitful and good. In fact, like the most fruitful and good thing in the entire world, like
yes, right.
redeemed the whole world. Right. But again, that's because it was a suffering that retained this relationship to the Father. Whereas our suffering, when it just wounds us and kind of like, it threatens our identity. It threatens to destroy us. Right. And so how that kind of suffering is it's not productive suffering. Right. It can be, when it's healed, it can be redeemed suffering. Right. Yeah. But that kind of suffering is not like,
sure.
Do you know what I'm saying?
I think so. Yeah.
Distinction?
I think so.
Yeah.
So I guess my next question though is, okay, this idea of redeeming and you know, the idea of redeeming this identity and healing the suspicion, I think there has to be like once again, like a grace and a knowledge given by God upon others. Once again, to not fall into the paradigm of suspicion, but to fall into a paradigm of love, right? And that includes compassion. I think compassion is a really important point to this, because when you see somebody with compassion, it's not so much an attack as it is you then giving something. Like I don't feel so threatened because I know I'm loving and compassionate towards you in your brokenness, in your sinfulness. That seems kind of like, I want to make that more concrete. But
okay, yeah.
So
I see where you're going.
Okay, let me try it again. Let me keep going. Okay, so I think what's happening right in this vision or worldview of suspicion is that the anthropology or the vision of that person, who that person is, the meaning of that person is not the most true form. So there's this idea of like the person being like a threat or dangerous or untrustworthy or Yeah, unreliable. Whatever it is, whatever the wound says that's not the most true will then be projected onto the person, and that their meaning won't be the truest part of who they are.
Yeah.
Right? But what is more true than the way someone can choose to harm us or sin against us that causes suspicion? What is more true than that?
Yeah.
I think what's more true can include that compassion, that like, oh, this person is good but struggles, or this person is good,
not defining them by that,
right? But
their ability to hurt you,
yes,
but seeing that there's more to them,
right? That they're in chains, that there's a reason upon them that is worthy of compassion, right?
Yeah,
because hurting people hurt people. They were probably hurt, right? So we're really kind of coming into like the realm of forgiveness too, right?
Yeah.
Like this disposition of love, compassion, forgiveness upon others, like over time, I think can really free you. And isn't compassion and forgiveness like precisely the path of redemption that Christ showed us? Like he died for us and forgave us and like welcomes us if we repent. And so So
it's sorry, I just had a really
go ahead.
I thought significant thought, maybe not. Like this idea that like there is evil, like people do evil things sometimes to you. You do evil things. I mean, there's a reality of evil, but that evil does not define the person, and it doesn't define reality. There's this more fundamental security that reality is good. People are good. I am good. So it kind of comes back to what we were talking about with like the difference between our suffering and Christ's suffering, and these wounds of our identity. Like if we can heal that sense of our identity as in this like relationship with fundamental understanding of reality as basically good, right? If we can have that healed, and that's a grace, right? That's not something we can do on our own. That has to be given to us by God, this sort of healing, this fundamental healing of like, again, our relationship with reality, our relationship with God. If we can experience that, then we're able to offer this forgiveness that you're talking about, this compassion, right? We're able to see, okay, like evil does not define you. Like, I know that you're committing evil, you've committed evil, but I don't see that as a fundamental threat to my existence anymore. Because my existence is rooted in something so much more powerful and so much more strong and secure. It's rooted in God's love, ultimately. And when you experience that, you're free then to look at and face the evil in the world, the suffering in the world, and have it not threaten you. Do you know what I'm saying? Like in the most basic way, like threaten your existence.
Right. Yeah.
So,
yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I definitely agree with that. Absolutely. I think what you were saying lines up with what John Paul II was saying. I was grabbing the book, the Theology of the Body book, but it says essentially just that, like, that we, once again, the person cannot be defined by evil. Like John Paul II is very adamant about that. Like that is not fundamental to the meaning of the person. It's not like it is, because it, in a way, like because human freedom allows for the choice of good and bad, like it's not always necessarily going to be that like somebody chooses bad, right? So there's like there's a fluidity from the human freedom, like evil and like doing evil, being evil is not a part of the fundamental meaning of the person. In
fact, it's not true. In fact, it's a lie. It's a twisting of the person. I think that's ultimately like the most helpful thing for me to understand. Like even in myself and my disposition towards my own sin, right? My own, shortcomings in life, like realizing that was actually a twisting of who I was. Not like disassociating yourself from it. Like that was, in a sense, it was you. Yes, you're responsible for it. I'm not saying that you're not responsible for it, but in a sense, it's not the truth of who you are. And that's why it's so detrimental. That's why sin is so harmful and so destructive, because it actually obscures the truth of who you are.
Right. Yeah.
It's a lie. It goes against reality.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that. So, but how do I like the point. I don't like that, the whole thing, the whole sin thing. I don't really like that, but no. But I'm just like also thinking of this in light of that, like this notion of like acceptance though of sin. Like we can be anchored in these things. We can be secure in God, but they're and we can like see that evil or concupiscence is not the most fundamental thing about a person. But there comes a point where there has to be a level of like accepting that this is the reality right now. Like there's a difference between saying this is not the most true part, but we don't want to like ignore the fact that somebody could be, or ourselves could be struggling with something very serious. Yeah. Right. So there's both. We have to hold both. That like you are not functioning out of your truest self. But while you're not, or while I'm not, like how am I going to handle that? I think that's like the crux of it. Like I can remember that this is not who you are. Like Christ said, like forgive them, they know not what they do. Like they don't know, and yet they're still like pounding the nails into his hands and his feet. Right. Yeah. So, yeah, I think like that's really like
how do you do that?
How do you do that? Yeah. How do you really like accept? I think truly like acceptance somehow, like it's almost like a taking on of the. Like a compassion, once again, like a taking on of the suffering of another, mercy, and like saying, this is really hard, and you did this to me, and I accept that this is really unfair and like difficult. But like somehow there has to be freedom in accepting that. Yeah. I guess I propose that. I think so. You could try that. Like if you are listening and you're struggling with suspicion or like suspicious hearts in your relationship or the people around you, like see if this helps. Like see if thinking these things, having that disposition of like mercy and like acceptance of the difficulty someone faces is like, see if that helps. I don't know. That's what I think.
I would say to like ask for your wounds to be healed. Like that for me is always, I totally agree with what you're saying with the compassion. Compassion is like a very transformative, if you're given the grace, right? It's a very transformative, beautiful. I mean, you're participating in Christ's compassion and his love for the world. I mean, it's incredible. But like sometimes we can try to do that when we're not healed. We could try to force ourselves to do that when we have not had this like restoration of our identity.
I see.
And it can be kind of forced, and it can be kind of almost, it can actually harm us. I think that I've experienced this. I think a lot of people experience this, and this sort of trying to force ourselves like before we're ready to like be perfectly forgiving and compassionate. And like, sometimes it can be like it can be fake, and it can be kind of a crutch in our approach to suffering, right? It can be not really facing it. So that's not, I don't think that's the answer. So like, I think first for me, it's begging, asking that God heal this wound of my identity. And it doesn't happen all at once. It happens, obviously through the course of our lives. But asking that somehow God gives us the experience of his love precisely in our wounds, especially these wounds, again, of our identity, like these really fundamental wounds. If we can experience that we're loved there, we then can have the grace to, like you're saying, be compassionate and not constantly brace ourselves for the next blow, right? We have this new freedom when we experience this healing and this love that allows us to, like Christ, be open even to being hurt, right?
Yes. And so I think you make a good point.
Yeah. So then we're not being suspicious anymore. But the suspicion is a kind of a self-protection. It's a self-defense mechanism, right? Suspicion kind of just like, I don't want to like expose I don't want to be open to the world around me. I don't want to subject myself to the possibility of being hurt because I've been hurt before and I didn't like it. So I'm going to constantly just anticipate being hurt and like brace myself again, be in this kind of posture of like self-protection, self-defense, versus allow myself to be open to just reality. And like, maybe that means I'm going to be hurt. Maybe that means I'm not. Most of the time, hopefully it means I'm not going to be hurt.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. You know? No, that's true. Yeah, that's definitely true. The self-defense thing, like, it's easier to like remain in a little bit of a level of suspicion so that if something does happen, you like confirm that, oh yeah, see, I was ready. But when you're not ready and caught off guard and something bad happens, oh yeah, it's like much more vulnerable, painful. It's like, it's probably the same amount of pain. One's just drawn out and then another one's like really intense. Right. So yeah, I don't know. It's very difficult, but I think once again, this topic is like worth talking about. And why? Because like we want for ourselves, but also you all to like be free, right? To be free to like walk around in peace and to like embrace love and not have these barriers that like the reality of sin creates in your lives, right? Like that's the point. Like the point of theology of the body is like to understand man, but also to hold that like the redemption is possible, right? The redemption of the experience of lack of love. And so, yeah, I think what points you made, Morgan, were really helpful. That like, as I said, like compassion and mercy is important, but not until you're ready, until God has also worked things out in you. And it probably happens like kind of at the same time, like both mutually. That's a good point. Yeah. Both mutually like happen at the same time. Like the more you try to be merciful, the more God heals you because you're entering into like the way in which he can heal you. Right. Exactly. This is starting to sound a lot. It can
happen like in one, it can be almost like one motion or whatever. Like it can be like in being compassionate, you can like experience this healing. I would just caution, don't try to like, be compassionate or be like perfectly compassionate or perfectly forgiving before like you have this experience of healing, because that can sometimes be detrimental. Right. But sorry, I cut you off. What were you saying?
No, it's okay. I was going to say that this is starting to sound like our vulnerability talk.
Yeah, I know. We always just talking about the same thing. This is just but that's life. I feel like there's always just like one truth and the different ways of
different ways of saying it.
Yeah, different ways of saying it. So
yeah. But I hope this was helpful. I think this was really, like I said, good to talk about and think about, because it is a theme in the theology of the body, right? Like there's sin and then shame and suspicion, right? So not only from like what others do to us, but also like we know our own sinfulness and think, well, if I could do this, then somebody else might. It just creates like once again, the most untrue thing, or the not true thing, right?
Yeah. You know
what I'm saying?
Yeah. I think so.
So we want to live by the truth, and we want to have a vision of love. We want to have a vision of security and peace and embracing others, right? And really just being secure with others, secure attachments to others, secure relationships. And so this is just one little piece to it, one little step to talk about suspicion and fear. So
yeah, it's a very real problem. I mean, people experience it all the time.
Yep. So hopefully this was helpful. Any other thoughts, Morgan?
I don't think so.
Okay, great.
Yeah, what about you?
No.
Okay.
No. Okay, well, thanks for joining me from afar again.
Yeah, of course.
Yes, always fun to talk. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Hope that you picked up some, little tips on this topic. Yeah, on suspicion. And hopefully it'll be helpful for you in your own journey of being free to love. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.